good afternoon, and thank you for joining our SBA Roundtable today. We're excited to welcome our attendees and our presenters, and we appreciate everyone taking the time to join us for this discussion. We're so happy to be able to offer our SBA Roundtables to our clients and local schools to give school business administrators an opportunity to share ideas and learn new things. So please feel free to ask questions throughout. We'll get to as many as we can. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Kathi Mantell, who's a partner in our government audit department, who's going to kick off today's presentation.
Again, welcome everybody. So the audits, as we said, just get more and more complicated. And when we concluded the last audit season, the partners were talking, Caitlin, about what things were difficult and how we could help our clients. And so you know that sometimes the extraordinary dollars are big dollars. We've talked in the last year about how the extraordinary aid was doubled almost in the last few years due to COVID, and those rates might go back down. So there's a lot of hinging on the extraordinary aid, but because it can be a very large number in certain districts, it becomes part of the single audit and is pretty much a target for the state single audit. So with that, I am known to be a very strong-armed person. So had a conversation with Sheryl Leidig and Wayne and said, wow, that's what you do? You get that many dollars? Would you be willing to speak? And she just immediately did. And just her thought process through it out the whole thing made so much sense. And when she sent over, you know, her strategy, her worksheets, it just all seemed that it would be a very helpful tool for all our districts and anyone else who is participating in the webinar. So thank you, Sheryl, for agreeing to do this. I think you have a fabulous program. And then Caitlin, again, is one of our managers, and she really does excel in the area of single audit and auditing different grants. So that's why they were pretty naturals for this presentation. So I welcome Sheryl to walk through the process that she goes through. And I'm not going to add anything to it because she had a lot of good points. So thank you, Sheryl.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Kathi mentioned, this is actually our first time presenting on this topic. So we're really excited to share what Sheryl and I collaborated on. We're really lucky to have her as a resource today because even just like talking to her over the last few weeks, I feel like I've learned even more about this grant and all the behind the scenes that maybe us auditors don't always hear about, all the crazy that goes in before it. So we divided today's presentation into 3 sections, and Sheryl's going to be handling the first 2, and she devised a plan, which what we're going to call today is the roadmap on how to go about filling out your extraordinary aid application. We divided it into 3 different sections. So we're going to talk about eligibility, categorized placement, and then ultimately calculating all the steps that go onto the application. And Sheryl's going to go into great detail on all of these steps. And then she's also going to continue into part 2, and we're going to deviate a little bit from the PowerPoint, and she's going to share her screen and show some examples that she put together, whether it's Excel spreadsheets that maybe you can utilize in the future if you want to revamp your own form of keeping backup, or if you want to just save them maybe to your desktop and use them as a good resource. But either way, we have you covered in part 2. And then part 3, I'm going to join in on the presentation at this point and talk about the reporting and documentation needs if extraordinary aid ends up getting selected as a major program during your annual audit. So we'll talk about everything that you should maintain so that it's easily accessible to your auditors. So go ahead, Sheryl. Wow, this was part 1.
Hi.
Lots to learn.
Thank you so much for having me. Extraordinary aid is quite a topic, right? It's a lot of dollars for some people. In Wayne, it's a lot of dollars. It's a lot of applications. I started doing this application about, I want to say this is my 3rd year. And when I first came in, I was thinking, how am I going to possibly get through all of these students? What's the best way that I can approach it? And being a former auditor, I knew that I had to come up with a way that would allow me to treat each eligible student as its own application. So how am I going to be able to capture all the costs for a student at a time? So for me, what I do is I first determine eligibility. So I break mine up into 2 categories. I work on my out-of-district kids first, and then I'll go and do my in-district kids. In Wayne, we do a lot of in-district. We have our own OT-PT, speech. So that's a little different than when an out-of-district necessarily, right? So the first thing to do before you even get going is you need to make sure that the student has an intensive service. If they don't have one of the allowable intensive services, you don't have to go any further. You can't claim that student. There's no point drilling down on that student. And the other key is to make sure that the intensive service that you're going to use is in the IEP and the student is actually getting the service. So if you're going to say, okay, this student had an extended school year of 210 days or more if they're K through 12, did they actually go to the extended school year? Because if they didn't attend in July or August, whatever it may be, then you can't claim it even though it's in the IEP. So the first thing I do is make sure that there's an intensive service. There's other things too. So they have to be between the ages of 3 and 21. And new last year and also this year is for the students that are under that S3434, which are the students that are staying for the additional year or 2. Those students you cannot include in X-aid. You would do that through a separate reimbursement. So you have to identify those students. So it could be a little tricky if you are not involved in that reimbursement claim as well. I do that as well in Wayne, so I know which students to not include because I already did the first half of the reimbursement. When it comes to eligibility, I find that I commonly use the same 3 main topics. I use the personal aid, the one-to-one nursing, or an extended school year. Not to say that there aren't others, but these seem to be the main recurring ones that I find. We do have a few residential placements. Maybe there was 1 or 2 that dealt with class sizes, but for the most part, mine seem to be the aides, the one-to-ones, and the ESYs.
Cheryl, can I interject?
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons why we were fascinated with the way that Sheryl approached this, and again, I was going to mention too, that she does have the audit background, so it's kind of a sense that follows you for the rest of your life. And just in the conversation, if you would share with the crowd how many students you have receiving extraordinary services, like what's your population? And then you said the first thing you do is look at the out of districts because that's typically a contract, which is easy to go through and easy to identify the costs. And then you go through the in districts, which have all the salaries and pieces that you have to put together. So what are your numbers in terms of students, just guesstimations?
So for this year, I've already done my out of district kids. I started Student Support Services provided me a list of approximately 121 that are out of district. And from that list, I was able to get 56 that I'm going to claim. And there's a few others that I have to follow up on. In district, I probably start with probably about 200 kids. And it could be down to 50. I mean, last year I had 152 applications. So I think it'll be somewhat comparable to that, if not more this year.
Okay, that gives people perspective in terms of how many kids they're dealing with.
Yeah, so it can feel overwhelming, which is why I think the way that I approach it mentally for me kind of calmed me if I took it one category at a time. So like I said, I start with my out of district kids first, because my student support services, they're great. They keep a whole list of the kids, their placements, the costs, and they even put the purchase orders for each student, which is very helpful. So I start off of that list and I go student by student. So I'll start with the first student, John Doe. Okay, John Doe goes to ABC school. Okay, let me pull up the IEP and see if in the IEP there is anything that would qualify. If there's something that would qualify, great. And you'll see when we get to the second part, I've created templates for myself where for each student, I did an Excel spreadsheet that basically mirrors the application that you're going to put into homeroom. So what I'll do is I'll list the student name, the NJ Smart number, their birth date, their classification, and what the intensive service is. And then I detail everything about the student. So what school are they going to? How many days? What is the tuition cost? And then since I'm looking at the IEP, I'll know, okay, are they having an aide? Because remember, they could be getting a one-to-one aide and be going to ESY. You're picking which service you want to use. I will then go through and try to isolate all the costs that I can associated with that student. So I'm not a program person. I'm a financial person, right? So I will look at the IEP, and if there are certain things in the IEP that I'm unsure of, I'll reach out to my student support services. So I could be looking at an IEP and let's say a student's getting like orientation and mobility. I don't know what that is. So I'll ask, hey, what is this? And they'll tell me what it is. And they'll go, okay, we use this vendor for the services provided. Or, okay, this person had this in the IEP. It's not in the school environment. It's saying outside. Who's the vendor for that? So it requires you to kind of go through the IEP and also be in constant communication with your special services, student support services, because they're going to be able to guide you as to basically what that student's year is going to look like, right? Because you're estimating. So you have an idea where they're starting and where do we think that they're going to end. Throughout the year, I am in constant contact with my special services department. So I know if people are coming in and out, and because they're so great on their spreadsheet, they'll write if someone was terminated. So I'm able to follow it not only on their spreadsheet, but I also will then go into our accounting software and pull up the PO so that I can see all the payments. Because remember, we got to make sure that the student's actually still going, right? Even just because they started there doesn't mean that they're still attending there. So by looking at the payments, making sure that we're current on the payments, being as when we pay, we get attendance records, I feel confident, okay, the student's still going there, even if they didn't tell me that they weren't. One of the other things that I do too, when I get to my in-district kids, is we use real-time software where I can generate a report that lists all XAID, it's called like an XAID listing, where it will list all of the students by their related services. And I'll use that report to go through my students to kind of isolate the kids that I will then use in district. So since I start with my out of district, as I'm using that other report, I can easily exclude, okay, I already looked at this student, I already looked at that student. And then I'll use that for my in-district kids. So first thing you got to do is determine eligibility. Who are you going to start with? Break it up into categories. The next thing you do when you start to go through the actual application is you have to put them in a placement. something that I have found specifically this year is that I have students that are going in and out of their placements, right? So you don't have to necessarily be in the same placement all year. What I'm finding this year as opposed to last year is I have a lot of students that are going on home instruction for a period of time for whatever reason. So when I'm going to approach doing the applications this year, their primary placement would be whether they're in district or out of district. But for that period of time when they're in home instruction, that would be a different placement. So that's category 2 would be for home instruction. So you have to determine, are they in district, out of district? Are they in district in a category 1, right? So let's back it up. So there's 3 different categories. There's categories 1, 2, and 3. You want to determine, are they in a public school with non-disabled peers? So that could be your kids in district. That could be a public school, or it could be a private school. They could also be in special ed classes, but it just means that they will have contact with non-disabled peers throughout the day. So even if they're in a self-contained class in district, if they have contact with non-disabled peers in a public setting, that would be a category 1. And then if you are placed in a category 1, you need direct instructional and support costs that exceed $40,000. I will say you'll be able to gauge pretty quickly what costs will start to count, right? When you're determining what your tuition is, you'll know that ahead of time, because your application, the student won't even be eligible for aid if you don't meet these thresholds to begin with, your 40,000 or your 55,000. You'll start to get a feel for, okay, this student may not qualify if their tuition's only X. So if I'm in my category 1s, I kind of know that even if they're doing an ESY, if they don't have an aid, I may not reach that cost level that I need. If they are category 1, so you need $40,000, any costs over $40,000, you will then get 90% of the excess. And what I do at the end is, once I have all of my people in, I try to identify what I think my total balance will be, what I think my award's going to be. And I'll show that when we get to part 2.
So Cheryl, I'm going to interject again. So I know the application just came out. I know you had relayed to us that you completed one section of the application, one of the categories of your kids. So prior to the pandemic, the reimbursement rate was 40 or 50%. And then on the last screen, you said 90%. Is this based on the new application, or is that based on what the last several years have been through COVID?
So that's the amount that they will give you over the 40. So once they calculate all, you get your cost for all the categories, they then prorate that again based on the rate that they're going to give you. So if you, let's say you start at $10 million, and then you are calculating what the excess is based on those different requirements, now you're down to say 5, they'll determine, we're going to give you 90% of your 5 million. So it starts really, really high, and depending on how it shakes out, you're not getting a dollar for dollar reimbursement. You're maybe, if you're lucky, getting, I think last year it ended up being 86, something like that, 83, 86% of your qualified cost net of all those adjustments.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So your category 2 is primarily your students that are in separate public schools. These would be your kids that are going to your county special services, your ed services, your commissions, your regional day. Again, that's a $40,000 limit and you'll get 75% of that. You could have a category 2 where the student attends a program and has daily interactions with non-disabled. That school could be a category 1. So even though, like, let's say you're going to a special services school district, if that program or that school under that has a non-disabled portion to it, then that could be a category 1. Again, that's where your interaction with your special services department becomes very important, because I wouldn't necessarily know that. I would just think, oh, Bergen County Special Services, it's got to be a category 2. So sometimes you have to really be in contact with them to be able to kind of navigate this. The final category is your category 3, which to me is my favorite category, because I feel like that is the easier category. Those are your kids that are just going out of district. I say it's easier because a lot of times all of their related services are included in the cost of the tuition. So there really is not too much extra that gets added to that. Whereas with an in-district, I'm calculating OT, PT, speech. This is just primarily what's the cost of the tuition, and if they're getting an aid, what's the aid, right? Sometimes I have a few kids that maybe needed nursing in addition, but it's pretty straightforward. It's usually not as crazy as an in-district calculation could be. The threshold for that's a little higher. It's 55,000, and then off of that, anything over the 55, you get 75%. The other type of situations you could have is a Naples placement. So when you're going to a type 3, category 3, these have to be pre-approved private schools by the state of New Jersey. So we all know that sometimes there's situations where you get taken to litigation, right? A parent is fighting a placement and all of a sudden can't come to terms with a placement, they want to go somewhere else. So if they're going to a placement that's not pre-approved, in order for it to be eligible for extraordinary aid, there's certain criteria that must be met, and all of the criteria has to be met. So you can't say, oh, okay, I have the child study team determined that it's needed. It was approved by a judge, but it's a non-accredited school. It doesn't work that way. Like, even if the judge approves it, it still has to be part of that criteria. I will say that if you are doing a Naples placement, when you're going through the application, it's a little more taxing as far as documentation is required. So for any other application, you're just putting the costs into homeroom. If you're doing a Naples placement, you're going to have to upload the documentation that you have that supports the fact that it is in fact an approved placement. So if, for example, I had one last year, I had, I think, 3 of them. And one, at first, my student support services were like, yep, they're all approved Naples placements. So I was like, okay, great. I need the court orders. I need the signed documentation from the admin judge. Got it. Got to the 3rd placement. And then it was like, oh, actually, this was just a settlement agreement between the parents and the districts. And because it was just an agreement agreed upon between 2 parties, that student wasn't eligible, which was upsetting because it was a large dollar amount. But I wasn't able to claim that student. I had to take that student off. So anytime you're using a Naples category, just be aware that you're going to need to be able to provide additional documentation in order to support that. Whereas with your other placements, when you submit, you're not required to upload anything else. That doesn't mean you're not required to keep documentation to support it. You just don't have to do it with the application. So once I determine who I'm going to use, I then start to go through the costs. How am I going to do the costs? So again, my out of district kids, they're pretty simple. What schools are they going to? I get the tuition contracts. I basically do a little application for each student with as much documentation as I possibly can. So I make a copy of the tuition contract. I make a copy of their main student info screen that has their NJ Smart number, that has their birth date. I will make copies of what I need from anything in the IEP, like their classification, and I keep everything together so that when I'm audited, like I was last year, when they pick a student, each student stands alone. So if you're looking at that student, what is it called? Student enrollment page where you print out for each person, they can just go through and easily tick and tie how I got the information that I put on that form. My in-district kids are a little different because there's additional costs and the way that you calculate it is a little different. The easiest way for me, and this is, you don't have to do it this way, I just do it this way because I like to try to do it as quickly and easy as I can. I use the certified tuition costs for tuition. I know you can use the, you could do it by each class that the student attends. That seems a little complicated for me. So I use the certified tuition. If you really felt that your certified tuition wasn't correct, you could use your budgeted tuition rates, but ours tend to be level. So I go with the certified tuition rates. You then again, since you're looking at the IEP, you're trying to capture all the costs associated with that student in the IEP. I then would come up with blended rates for my OTPT speech. So I have a whole sheet where I say, okay, if someone is going for, you know, twice a week for 30 minutes, it costs X for the year. I do a whole calculation where I take that and I extrapolate it for the year. Same thing with my aides. I do a blended rate because our aides tend to move as they're needed. So to try to follow it may not always, that one aide may not start and end with the same student. So I do a blended rate for my aides. I will say one thing about aides, if you're claiming a one-to-one aide, it has to actually be a one-to-one aide, right? So you can't use a general classroom aide as your intensive service. That aide has to be with that student, or the aide would have to be with one student in the morning and a totally different student in the afternoon in order for that to work. Sometimes you'll see like shared aide. So you just got to be careful about that. But I do that for my blended rate. You'll see on the sheet where I show you kind of how I calculate it. I also calculate, we run an ESY program. So I calculate the cost for that because our kids that are in district tend to take our ESY program. So I know what that cost is. And then there's just certain situations that you have to kind of be aware of, right? There's certain deductions as you're going through. If you get semi, you would have to deduct for that student's reimbursement for semi. So that semi report will come out. Usually it's like the beginning of May. I'll then look at that report and see if any of those kids are kids that I'm claiming. I think in an ideal world, I'd love to be able to claim every single cost associated with that student, but I have limited time, right? It's due May 26th, which is not a lot of time in the grand scheme of things with how many students that I have. So I really just try to do the best that I can. Sometimes it's really not cost beneficial to try to get every single little cost that you can. But I feel like I get the majority of the cost and that it's my best estimate that I could make given the situation.
So Cheryl, I have a quick question. You said that You assemble your documentation by student. In what form do you keep that? So if you have 150 students who are eligible for extraordinary aid, do you keep it electronically? Do you have a paper binder for each student? What do you do?
So I keep it with binders. I'll keep one Excel workbook that has all my individual tabs, but for the actual application per student by itself, I will print everything out and have a hard copy, and I keep binders. So I think last year I had 3 binders. I had 1 binder of all my out of districts, and then I had 2 binders for my in-district kids. And because I'm a little neurotic, they were alphabetical. So they matched the applications as I had printed them out. It would just be a lot more work for me to keep it electronically. I mean, I would love that, but it takes a while just to kind of assemble it to begin with. So I have some
another step.
Right. I have some stuff electronically, right? I keep copies of all of the applications that I print off the homeroom, but all of my backup, I have hard copies of, and I keep a whole folder of all my calculations that I do that support. You'll see the one sheet that I do where I get the rates. And I try to be as exact as I can, right? I reach out to the Commission for the Blind and I get a listing of all the students and the level of service that they're at, so I can calculate those rates. If I'm doing certain calculations like child study team costs for my out-of-district kids, I keep copies of the budget report that I use for the salaries and my enrollment count that I use. I try to keep all that documentation because sometimes I don't remember what I did yesterday. So to have to then in months down the road be asked, hey, how did you calculate that cost? It's like, that's a good question. So I like to keep all of the documentation together so that I could just easily look it up if asked. And also when I have to do it the next year, I know what documents I need.
Right. So I guess the answer to that question is you do it in the moment, right? While you're doing it, calculating it, thinking about it, you're putting it in a binder. And then when our staff comes in to do the audit, if they select 10 or 15 of those kids, they're in the book and everything related to that student is in the book. So that really is good. I want to take another opportunity before Sheryl talks about samples and examples of how she manages this, because we all think differently. I'm sure there are people in the audience who say, well, Sheryl's with Wayne School District, it's a big district, you have a lot of support staff, but as you can see, as the assistant BA, she is preparing this application. And so it's good to have somebody who's very knowledgeable and strong at the top of it. Through any process in life, and we always say it about the audit, communication is key. So absolutely number one is having clear communication with the Special Services Department. When we come in as auditors, we find that, you know, problems start when Special Services is not in sync with the business office. So that's an absolutely necessary number one requirement. And then you have a smaller school district who doesn't have much support staff, again, limited time, small window for the application, makes it very contentious. But hopefully the examples and samples that Sheryl has to share might help you to streamline the process. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that when you apply for other grants, your special services people say, okay, Title I, we're going to have salaries, we're going to have these other costs, and the application goes in just based on that budget. It's approved and it comes over to finance. It's entered into the accounting records and you spend it in accordance with that budget. Well, extraordinary aid is a completely different animal. And so this application process is very involved. And as I've said to clients, this injects a huge amount of human error. I mean, there are so many things that you're doing along the way, so many calculations that you're making. No other grant is this complicated. And I know we said to Sheryl, how do you feel about it? I thought you had closer to 500 students. Maybe you have 3 or 350. But, you know, at the end of the day, you think that you gave it the best effort and you captured as much as was humanely possible in the window of time. And so you may not capture every single little thing, but I think you walk away at the end of the day saying you think you've got the majority of it. So I'll end there and let Sheryl go on and talk about how she goes through this.
So I do like Kathi said, I do the bulk of the calculations and I do all the determinations. I do have someone that helps me enter all of the applications into the homeroom, right? Because it kind of is not ending just because I do my individual stuff. Now I got to get it in, right? I'm only halfway there by just doing my stuff. I will say I probably look at all of these applications multiple times before I certify. I have my initial, then I check it. I give my documentation to my accountant that helps me enter it. She double checks what I have. She puts it into the homeroom. Then I will go through and check it again. Like she prints it out, I'll check it. We're checking it, we're changing things because she'll catch things that I put wrong. I'll catch things that she puts in wrong. So it really is a rolling process. Because we are so large, it does take quite some time. So I actually started doing X-Aid a few weeks ago. Like I said, I just finished my out of district kids first roundish yesterday. So it is a process. I would say the earlier you can start, the better. But everyone's district is different and your time requirements are different. So hopefully these examples will be helpful to some people. Let me just see here. How do I get out of here? Oh. So the first thing I have is this is a worksheet that I do for, now it's going to freeze. It's great. This is for my in-district, but I'm going to pull up my out-of-district kids. Okay, here we go. So for my kids that go out of district, I've created this spreadsheet that basically helps me document all of my costs, right? So I have my name, my NJ Smart, my date of birth, their eligibility criteria, the intensive service. And I tried to, like I said, mirror it like the application. So I then would put their primary placement. For this example, there's only one placement, but if I had multiple placements, I would add a second, I would add some more rows and say, you know, second placement. Number of days, because it's going to ask you the number of days. In this case, 205 days. The tuition cost, since the cost of the ESY is in the cost of the tuition, that's all in my tuition costs. And then my related services costs. So I have child study team costs, which is a calculated cost that I have for each of my out of district kids. And then I have the cost of the ESY aid and the one-to-one aid. So before there's any prorating being done for this student, I have total qualified costs of $126,000. So how it would work is I get any excess over $55,000 because this is an out of district kid. So I'm not going to get aid off of $126,000. I'm going to get aid off of $71,000. I'll get the differential. And then from that $71,000, maybe they'll give me, if we're lucky, 85% of that for that student. And then that just keeps adding. I also make notations for myself. So I remember, okay, this school was on PO, blah, blah, blah. Let's say that this person had nursing. I would put the nursing PO too. I just keep adding lines. So everything that I want to claim, I'll just add another line. Nursing, there's the cost. And I look at the categories. If it's semi, I put semi and then deduct it, because I really want to be able to just at the end of the day, my total qualified cost number will agree to what I'm putting in the application. I want to know that I'm accounting for everything so that I check it real quick. I know that I've captured everything.
So you create this same tab for every student?
Yes. So then I'll call, I'll label this John Doe, and then I'll copy and do another tab. I will print this out with all the backup. So I'll print this, the tuition contract, commission from the blind statement, my calculation for my costs. I'll staple it. Right now, I just have them all sitting there stapled. Once we enter it, I'll then print out the application from homeroom and I'll attach it to this packet that I created for this student.
So in your district, you could have 120 tabs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have, right now, I just did them. I have like 56 tabs or something.
Wow.
And I do it alphabetically so that I could just kind of flip through it easily. But I found that this was really helpful. I kind of recommended something like this when I was an auditor and used to audit extraordinary aid, because I remember going in being like, how are you coming up with these costs? And it would be like, oh, well, I think they go to this school, and then you'd have to go over here, and then you'd have to try to look over there and take this book, take that book. I just wanted to help the auditor so they're in and out as quickly as possible. And I also like to be able to
Thank you.
I also like to be able to fact check myself real quick. I don't want to have to keep going back and forth. What am I doing? What am I doing? So I use this for my out of district. Okay. So for my in district, this is kind of I use this as one big worksheet. So I'll start listing all of the kids, and I inherited this when I got to Wayne, and it's been working pretty well. So I kind of tweak it as I need to. Same concept. You're putting their name, their ID number, date of birth, their grade, their classification, the school that they're attending. Now, I use the certified tuition rate. The reason that, if you notice here, it says autism. So this is an autistic child in an LLD class. We don't have an autism program. So you can't necessarily go off of the classification. You have to go off of the class that they're in. So you could have an autistic child in an MD class, or you can have an autistic child in an LLD class. I want to make sure that I'm using the right certified tuition rate. There's my tuition. If I look at the student's IEP, they have a one-to-one aid. This was my calculated para cost. So you'll see all my in-district kids, if they have a one-to-one aid, I'm using the same cost for the paras because it's a blended rate. I take all of my aid costs, netted against the health benefits, divided by the number of paras that I have on staff, and I get an average. Again, I'm going to come up with calculated amounts for OT, PT, speech, behaviorists. Again, there are some assumptions that I make based off of the IEP. So if they say they get a behaviorist once a month as needed, I don't know what that means, right? So I kind of will make an assumption throughout the whole thing and say, okay, I'm just going to use the rate that I calculate for 20 minutes a month. I kind of lowball myself because I don't want to make it too much. And then I'll use that going forward for anyone where it's not twice a week, twice a month. You could have a T cost, counseling cost, whatever miscellaneous costs. And then this is my ESY. This will then, if I had semi, I would deduct it here and I'd get a grand total for my costs. And here's where I start to get where I think my application is going to be. So I have total tuition, 75%. I think my total cost will be that. And then what I do is that I compare that to what actually ends up entering the application to see if I'm okay. If I'm not correct, maybe I'm missing something. And that's a trigger to me to go back. Just real quick, this is what I do for myself. So I can try, this is off of last year. I just kind of want to get an idea. How much do I think I'm going to be able to get? And if you notice, this kind of just mirrors the award notice. I know once I've entered all my applications, I know what my costs are. I then reduce it for the excess amounts, right? Based on the percentage that I think I'll get. So last year, I had 152 applications and I submitted costs of $5.8 million after the prorations for the excess cost amount. I was using wishful thinking, I guess, the same proration amount as the year before. So I said, if I got the same amount, I'd get 5.2 million. I had budgeted 2.7, so I would have an add-on to my 2% of 2.5 million. Didn't come in exactly. I think I ended up with 4.9 million at the end of the day because it was a little lower, but I do year-end projections, so I kind of wanted to know where I could think I may fall. And then the other thing that I do, okay, so I said we do a lot of in-house OT-PT speech. These are rates that I calculate based on big calculations by category. So for example, I said down here, here's my para rate and my paras, my shared paras, which is just half of that, the cost of the LPNs, because we have LPNs on staff. I then try to determine what is the hourly rate for OT-PT speech. What would it be for 40 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes? And then what would it be if they get it once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, based on the number of weeks in the school, gives me a cost, so that when I'm doing that big Excel spreadsheet and I'm reading someone's IEP and it says they get OT 2 times a week for 30 minutes, I go to my sheet and go, oh, okay, it's $3,400. And then I just plug it in, right? So you kind of have the same cost over and over. It seems to work for me. It may not be for everyone, but I think I have a process that at least I'm familiar with now and helps me get through it in a timely manner. And every year I kind of add different things. I see things a little differently. Maybe I reread something a little differently. I'm okay, I'm going to add this cost now, or, oh, I wasn't thinking of that. And it's an evolving process, and I do the best that I can in the time that I have. And it's what works for me. So hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah, so it's what you do to make sure you feel confident and that you've looked at everything you could look at and you considered everything that you possibly could. So I guess we can just lead into Caitlin talking about what we do when we come and we select it as a program. And I see we have 7 questions in the queue, and we will address those as soon as we finish up.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too, Kathy. I was reading them as Sheryl was going, and I think she actually addressed some of them, and I'm hoping some things in the next few slides will address some things too. Okay, so let me share my screen. All right, so at this point, you have now successfully completed your extraordinary aid application, and we're going to fast forward a few months, and now it's time for the annual audit. So part 3 today is just going to be me talking about what you should be ready for, maybe what you should maintain and have readily accessible for your auditors if extraordinary aid ends up being selected as a major program with the single audit testing portion of your audit, which, as Sheryl mentioned, she got selected last year. So there's always the chance, especially with the higher awards that are going out, that it could be you. So we all know that extraordinary aid is...
Caitlin, I'm so sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but we can't really know if extraordinary aid is going to be selected. So we have to see how the district expended special revenue funds, and they go into the CFA schedules, the state and federal award schedules, and sometimes getting the information from Fund 20 is not the very first thing that we'll get when we're in the audit. It's what we like to do because then we can plan the single audit. But we have a matrix and we have to put all those programs on the matrix, and we have to go through risk analysis and everything else to determine what programs we have to select. So where Caitlin says, if you are selected, you can't just say, well, I'll wait and see if it's selected, because every year it has the propensity to be selected. So I just, some of the things that Sheryl and Caitlin are talking about today, as much as you can incorporate them on a regular basis so you don't have to go back and backtrack anytime, would be such a relief to you. So Caitlin, I promise I won't interrupt.
Oh, no, it's okay. I was going to touch briefly on it. Okay, so I was saying, we all know that extraordinary aid is a state grant. So the compliance supplement, which is where all of the auditing requirements are in a nice format, can be found on the state website. So the entirety of part 3 today is just going to be highlights from that compliance supplement, because that is my roadmap when I need to come in and audit a grant. So I did include the link here on the slide if you so wish to click it after the presentation and read the entirety of the document. I think it's only like 4 or 5 pages. So it's not as daunting as a federal grant, but this is definitely one of the hardest state grants for both the district, I think, to calculate, and for your auditors to come in and recalculate everything. So, I don't want to downplay anything with this grant, but it's a smaller compliance supplement, but it's very strict with everything. So for part 3, I was thinking, like, how do I want to drive home all of these points that Sheryl would have already gone over with the details and stuff, because I kind of wanted a side-by-side comparison of everything. So the next few slides are going to be exact duplicates of what Sheryl's slides were, and I'm basically going to be graying out the information that she already talked about and then inserting all the audit requirements right under it. So it gives you that comparison, and you can kind of utilize what Sheryl just went over and then what I'm adding to it. So let me go to the next slide so you can kind of see what I am referring to. Okay, so the top part should look very familiar to you. It's the grayed out section that I just referred to, and it's how Sheryl started her presentation with step 1 of eligibility. So that's obviously where the audit is also going to start, with eligibility. And as Kathi was mentioning, single audit testing is based on a rotational schedule, but if your district is getting close to or over $750,000 as your award for extraordinary aid, there's a good chance it's going to be up for testing. And it also means that you probably have a lot of students that qualify in order for you to get to that value of an award. So there's just no plausible way that the auditors are going to be able to test all 100 students, let's say. So step 1 for the audit is we're going to request the report that Sheryl previously mentioned. It's called List of Student Enrollment Information. It'll have all of your qualified students, and from there, we're going to select a very specific sample of students that we're going to work for the audit. And then from there, let's say we select 10 students, I'm going to request several pieces of backup for the audit, one of which being the IEP. That's just where I like to start. And then once I get the IEP, I'm going to just start going through it and circling things, highlighting things, and looking for that crucial information, which is some of the bullet points that I listed here. So you have your basic student information, clearly going to be looking for name, their grade, and also their birth date. So if you refer back up to that gray section, Sheryl talked about one of the criteria being that their age needs to fall between 3 and 21. So right off the bat, I'm going to verify that their birth date is within that window. I'm going to keep going. I want to look at the start and the end date of the IEP. So for this, I always want to say, I want to request the full IEP, right? Because their annual review could happen in February. So all of a sudden I have one IEP that doesn't get me to the end of the fiscal year. So you would have to provide their full, which might be one IEP, 2 IEPs, depending on whatever gets me from 7-1 to 6:30. I would need all multiple IEPs depending on how many times the review process happened for that specific student. And then I also want to find their classification, which Sheryl also talked about before, whether they're autism, LLD. I'm going to circle it, and I'm going to circle back to it in a little bit when we touch on some other points. I'm just gathering as much information as I can from the IEP at this point. And then lastly, I'm going to look through the daily schedule portion of the IEP, which I think the specific title of that section is the summary of special education programs and related services. So for this, I'm literally going to read through their entire schedule for the year and try to find that intensive service. So the ones that Sheryl mentioned before are definitely the ones that I see the most in districts also, the ESY for more than 210 days or the one-to-one personal aid, nursing services. So usually that will like jump right off the page and I can highlight it. And I will immediately check that to the application because as Sheryl said, if those two don't talk to each other, then there's no point in going further. So if that student's extraordinary aid application, if they're claiming an intensive service for ESY more than 210 days, and I do not see ESY for more than 210 days anywhere in the body of the IEP, then there's no reason to go any further. It's kaput, like it doesn't match. This student it's not jiving and it wasn't a qualified student to begin with. So testing ends. So you never want to see that happen. So that's where I start because if that's not matching, then there's really no point in going further. Okay, so then we'll move on to step 2. So we're assuming at that point, I gathered all my information, everything is matching so far, we move on. So at the second category, this should all look familiar from what Sheryl talked about, is determining their placement category. So in the compliance supplement, it specifically talks about wanting to verify that that student belongs to the district, and you verify that with school registers. So the second thing I always request is their on-roll register. Usually this is a very large document. I will flip through it, hone in on finding that student, making sure that everything agrees pertaining to where they're placed on that on-roll register. And then on the side, I also included an alternative method because I know it gets a little tricky with Category 3 placements, which are going to private schools, and sometimes you might not have an on-roll register for them, and your auditor might just revert to basic ASSA testing at that point, where they would request tuition contracts and purchase orders to prove that there was billing with that district and that payments were being made, thus ensuring that the student is attending that district. So I just wanted to include that as an alternative method here. Not too much on this slide. Again, we're just checking off like some basic preliminary things before we get into the full application, which is where we are now on slide 3. So we have already requested their IEP. I've proved that they're on the on-roll register. So at this point, I want to see their full-fledged extraordinary aid application. And the application, for Sheryl and I, we kind of like describe it as 2 parts, right? The first part is the placement costs, which has the tuition, and the second part is the related costs. But all those sections have a bunch of values to it, a bunch of amounts, and they're all going to subtotal to the very end, which is your qualified cost. So this is the heavy part of the audit because I'm going to be going through every single section with the goal of recalculating that amount so that at the end of the day, I also get to that qualified cost that's on the application. So the first half, like I mentioned, is the placement cost, and we put stars around it as the preferred method because I too it's so much easier when we use the certified tuition method. It's easier for the district, it's easier for us, and like overall, it's just the ability of or the less mistakes, like right. It's kind of, you're just looking at this letter, you're matching it to the certified tuition, you're not recalculating anything here. So that's why we mentioned that it's really the preferred method. So I'm going to skip to the next slide real quick. We put a screenshot of, we'll call this ABC district. So this district utilized the certified tuition method, and they have all the categories here. So one of the spreadsheets that Sheryl was listing, she talked about how the student was in a class that was autism, and that's what I would have already found on the IEP from 2 slides before. I would have circled it. I would have identified that that's their classification, and then if we're using the certified tuition method, I can easily identify the autism rate, $27,027, and I can make sure that that is what's being reported on the application. So why the IEP always needs to talk to what's going on into the application. And then we flip back to our previous slide. And I just want to talk about category 3 here too, because obviously you're not going to be using the certified tuition method here. As Sheryl previously mentioned, they're going to a private placement school. You have a tuition contract or agreement with that school. So you would just need to provide that back up to the auditors. And in the body of that contract would be the value for the tuition. So you easily be putting that onto your application, and that's what I would be matching up for. Okay. And then the second half of the application is the related cost portion. This is the biggest hang up during the audit, and it is so math intensive that I really just want to stress that the more paper trail you give the auditors, the better. So I included a formula here, which Sheryl also used as an example in her previous slides. So we'll kind of go through the formula and then we'll dissect it a little bit. So let's say this student that I've decided to test for extraordinary aid receives occupational therapy in an individual setting. They go for 30 minutes, which I highlighted on the nice screenshot at the bottom there, twice a week. The therapist's hourly rate is $44, and it's over the entire course of the school year for 39 weeks, and it comes out to the $3,455. So this district has a paper trail where I have this chart and I can easily identify how they got from point A to point B, which is the $3,000. So let's say I'm looking at the application and they reported $5,183 for the related service, and I'm coming to the $3,455. So the numbers are right on top of each other there in the screenshot. Because there's that paper trail, I can easily identify like, oh, this application, this person must have used 30 minutes 3 times a week. But when I'm reading the IEP, I can clearly see that it says 30 minutes 2 times a week. So something's not talking to each other, and I can easily go and talk to that person who filled out the application and say, I'm recalculating it using 2 times a week, and show them like, you know, in the IEP, and then maybe I'm missing something, maybe I don't have the right IEP, maybe it was just a clerical error and the person used 3 times a week, but I can easily hone in on what part might be wrong. So the worst thing is if there's none of this chart, because if I'm coming to 3,000 and the application has 5 and there's no paper trail, like I don't even know where the calculation possibly could have gone wrong. And if this application is due the end of May and your audit's not until November, you could easily have forgotten also how you got to that point. So I think Sheryl did a really good job stressing, like, keep it in Excel, keep the backup per student. And like this, I just wanted to like hone in on like how it could go wrong if you don't have that backup, because it's just so many moving parts that you really want that paper trail for yourself, like for next year if this person qualifies again, and then also for the auditor, and it's a quick answer and you can have us leave quicker, as Sheryl said.
So I'm going to interject, Caitlin, as an auditor reviewer. And I say to myself, okay, this all sounds wonderful, but how do you come up with the occupational therapist hourly rate? Is that something that's stated, or is that something that you have to blend?
Yes, so that's the other part I was going to stress here, Kathy. So we are on the same page, which is good. So everything in this calculation you can find in the IEP for the most part, right? The IEP will say if they go 30 minutes, if they go twice a week. The only thing that's not going to be in that IEP is the hourly rate for the therapist, which off the bat, I just would not know. Like, where are you coming up? Where's a reasonable amount that you're saying that that hourly rate is $44? So I put as that last bullet point on the screen that whether they're a therapist in district or at a district, there's some type of contract. You either have their approved upon salary that you're paying them, or some type of an agreement if they're a third party, and you can back into how that hourly rate was calculated. So it's just one step further, one other piece of backup that you would need to give us so that we can reasonably say, oh, you know, this person's making $88 an hour. So if this child is attending for 30 minutes, we cut it in half and we use the $44 rate. But thanks for bringing that up, Kathi. And then I just wanted to talk briefly on one of the first few slides here. I'm not sure if we talked about it, but we included a link to the frequently asked questions page, which is on maybe like slide 2, I think, right under all the, we listed like the few intensive services that are most common. And then there's a link that says you can go here to read all of them. It's basically a very informative FAQ page that I use often, because no matter how well equipped you are, there's always going to be that one obscure student that you might want to refer to this FAQ to learn more about. So one of the most common questions we get is, because its application is based on estimates and reasonably projecting the costs for the year, what happens if the costs significantly change? So halfway through this paragraph, it says in bold that if the value is significantly different or falls below those thresholds that Sheryl talked about, what do you do? So if you read through the paragraph, it basically says there's no actual requirement that you need to redo the application, but if it's a significant enough change, you do need to notify the Office of School Finance in writing so that they can adjust your award accordingly. And at the very bottom there, it includes an email for the state too. So for example, if you are projecting a Category 3 placement, let's say it costs $100,000 for 10 months of the year that they're going there, and for some reason they don't attend the last 3 months, right? So that's a significant change if you're only paying the $70,000, but you have projected on their application the $100,000. And honestly, if the auditors pick that, they're probably, because it's a Category 3, it's going to be that easier one that we're recalculating, and we'll also notice that difference. So if you do contact them and tell them about the significant change, just make sure to keep a backup, and you know, it'll just be an easy conversation that you also notice the difference, the same difference that your auditors came to. But it is, you know, the point is to get to a reasonable estimate. So this would only be if there was a very significant change in anything. And then lastly, in case anybody is using this PowerPoint going forward as like a reference point for what to gather before your audit begins, I didn't want everyone having to like read through the last 6 slides. So this slide really just brings everything together that you would need for your auditors. So well, pretty much everything we just talked about, your list of student enrollment information, which is where your auditors will select the sample of students they're going to test. You want to provide on-roll registers and all of the backup for the costs, which include placement costs and related services costs. So that's across the board, general things. And then for the students that do get selected for testing, just make sure you have available their full IEPs that cover the entire fiscal year period, their specific extraordinary aid application, and any type of private tuition contracts and agreements if that applies to the student. So I think that does it for part 3.
That's it. So I wanted to interject one thing. As we talked about this program and I saw the organization that Sheryl had and how she compiles this, I thought that it would be a great tool. And we all know that a school district can go for 5 years, 7 years with someone who is charged with violating the application. They know what they're doing. They know how they created it. What happens when the person who's going to be doing the application changes? It's kind of like doing the ASSA DRTRS. Is there written instructions? Is there some kind of a roadmap as to how to do this? So I think that this program kind of puts that seed in there, and maybe some of the bits and pieces of this program could become your how to prepare the application. Certainly any of the auditors at Nisivoccia would be happy to assist you in every way. I'm not going to speak out of turn, but I think Sheryl has already said that if someone needed a spreadsheet or something, she would give an example. You know, we're all a team of people trying to help each other get through this. As much as you may dread the application and the process, we're not really thrilled about having to audit it either. So yeah, it's best, you know, we just want to set everyone up for success. And so I think you always have to be concerned about whether the person who's preparing the application may change over time, and how are you going to relay how it's supposed to be done. That's where you can find yourself in trouble. So Sheryl, I'm going to give you an opportunity to add any comments before we entertain a few questions that we have.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's just been very helpful to just keep whatever I'm using, keep all my documentation, keep all my spreadsheets, so that I'm able in the next year to pick up where I left off and to kind of refresh my memory. Okay, that's how I did it. Because you want to also keep it consistent. You don't want to calculate something one way one year, and then all of a sudden now you're doing it a completely different way. And then it's going to change unless you were obviously doing it wrong. But, and just being organized really helps get through it, I find. And just do your best. I mean, there's such a short window of time. I would say if you have the ability to start early, start early. And if you don't know the answer, ask your auditors. You can also email down to the help desk. I've done that before. They get back to you. Just ask the question, and then you'll kind of pick up your own tricks and tips and applications.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, so Katie, I'm going to have you look at the questions that we have, and we can see if we feel they were answered.
Okay. There's some longer ones here that are a little more specific, it seems, to people's situations. One of the ones we got was, what type of evaluation cost can you include in all the categories? Do you guys touch on that?
I think that might have been an early question prior to Sheryl getting into everything with the slides. So unless that person wants to respond, I think we're good with that question.
Okay. What about, is it typical that the business office does the extraordinary aid application? Depends.
I think it depends. I mean, the business office will have all the financial information. So in some capacity, you have to work together. Whether they're the ones to actually submit it, I think it depends on the district, honestly.
So Caitlin, can you comment from our perspective? Do you recall getting, knowing where a district had someone outside of the business office submitting the application?
I've definitely seen it both ways. I think it goes back to what Sheryl was saying, and how well staffed maybe these child study team is, depending on, they might have an assistant who's very technical, and maybe they're the go-between for the business office and the rest of CST. But I really think it does have to be the connection of both departments, because you can only decipher the IEP as much as surface level without having to question the behind the scenes from somebody else. So I think it goes both ways. So depends on what the staff level is.
I think it's interesting because this is the one grant where both pieces are very important. So you need to know the program side enough, and you need to make sure you're capturing all the costs.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have the right costs, then the whole grant can be in jeopardy as to what you're actually claiming. But then if you don't understand the program side, then you're not claiming things. So it really is a collaborative effort. So even if the business office isn't doing it, in some capacity, the business office should be involved to make sure that you're kind of guiding them in the correct avenue.
Another question, I think we got this one from more than one person, just confirming that you get the tuition from the budget for that year. And someone else said the certified tuition rate is from the prior year. Yes. So
you're using the 21-22 certified tuition rates. So this would have been the ones that came out in February or January, February, March, whenever it came out. But it's the most recent one. Yeah, you are only going to use the budget, the current budget, if you feel that your certified tuition rates are not accurate, but then you would have had something happen in district to make you think that that was no longer accurate. There'd have to be some big thing that would have happened.
Okay. Kathi, I don't know if I missed any big ones here that you would want to address.
I think it's the last one. It says regarding the days in an IEP, the IEP may not specifically state the number of days. It just says the student is eligible. So I've seen like a couple things where it maybe has like a range, like starting 7-1 through like, you know, what I was talking about before, like depending on when that annual review is, like 7-1 through like 228 or something like that. And then maybe the rest of the year they no longer qualify for OT or something because they had that annual review and they're not getting that service anymore. I feel like most of the ones I've seen have very specific dates in them. Do yours, Sheryl?
The IEP, you mean?
Yeah, like I'm used to looking at their schedule and saying like, oh, you know, this person is eligible for it, you know, the full fiscal year, so that I can easily calculate it.
Yeah, I kind of would use it more so as like, when are their IEPs being evaluated too? If that's the most recent one, they haven't had their update yet, you're still going to kind of go off of that.
So
Right?
I'm not really sure. I'm sorry.
We're talking about the term, right?
Yes.
I read
so
it
I'm not
as
sure if the question is, must the number of days be stated, or if it just says the person is eligible and you just calculate them for the whole. But you told me, Sheryl, that you communicate to find out when kids enter the program and if they're terminated, so that you're not over-reporting.
Right.
So I think it's just the answer to that question is probably going to be, I guess it really doesn't matter if the IEP states the number of days. That if it's not stated, it would probably mean that they were going to be there for the whole year, but then you have to look at attendance and whether the person has been in the program for the whole time.
I think that's a good way to say it.
Did we cover the question that shared aides, classroom aides can't be counted, but what about shared aides with a 2:1 ratio? Is that where you said that if a student has a full-time aide, you charge the full cost of that aide? And if someone is an aide for one student in the morning and one in the afternoon, then you divide it among the students.
Right. You can't have an aide if they're servicing, you know, 13 kids at once. It's got to be very specific. Obviously, if the ratios of the classes are different, that'll come into play too. But, and I think the other important thing about the 210 is that it's got to be for 4 hours a day. So it's got to be at least 4 hours a day for 210. Except if it's pre-K, then it's a 10 hours a week minimum.
Okay, and then someone asked, can we have a copy of the spreadsheet as a template? I think we agreed that that would be available. And again, Sheryl was very gracious to put herself out there and to share with us, but she was very excited about it. So if anybody does have any questions or want resources, we'll have Katie post them. But when you have questions, reach out to whoever is managing your audit, and we will get you answers to the questions. And who knows, maybe the next time we do this presentation, we'll have another person who's willing to put themselves out there, and we'll blend. We'll blend resources. So again, it's getting everybody the resources that they need and developing a plan for how to calculate it and how to keep it a streamlined process so that you don't miss anything. I'm seeing the questions growing. Is anybody looking at those?
Can you count?
Yeah, looks like we answered most. The follow-up was, can you count the aid is assigned to 2 students in the same class at the same time? But no, yeah, otherwise it's just thank yous. And
okay, thank you. Awesome. Well, again, every time we're engaged to have, when we decide we want to do a roundtable, it's all about timing, your schedules, our schedules, how to make it work. But I know Mon and Val and Heidi and Caitlin were they honed in on extraordinary aid pretty quickly. And then we had to figure out how to squeeze it in between the time the application was due and after you had gotten through the budget process. So I hope the timing was good. We are doing a presentation at the New Jersey ASBO conference in June. So if any of you have any topics that you would like us to discuss, please send them to us. We're happy to hear what is of interest or what is creating some difficulties out there so we can assist. So again, thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Sheryl, and Katie. Always thank you for helping us keep
thank
it
you,
together.
everybody. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your day.
Yes.
See you next time.
Bye.